What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Home Built Workshop. My name's Jeff. I hope your day is going great. For those of you that have been following along on the channel, you'll know that I recently completed building my own homemade edge sander. This thing turned out great, and I've got 5 episodes in a complete playlist on my channel. There's a link down below. But if you'd rather not go through the playlist, I decided it might be kind of fun to just put all of these episodes together into one full-length film for your viewing enjoyment. Before we jump into this edge sander build, I'd like to say thank you to all of you. Those of you that have been following along on the channel for years and years, those of you that tune into the live streams every Wednesday at 9 a.m., those of you that engage on the Facebook group, all that sort of thing, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you so much. And if you're new to the channel, maybe you've just found the channel recently, welcome. I hope you'd consider hitting that subscribe button so you can follow along. We do a wide range of different styles of projects here, and I'd love to have you follow along. So without further ado, let's grab some popcorn, your favorite beverage of choice. Settle in, and let's watch this edge sander come together. Basically, we're going to start with the contraption that I used as the base, something that I picked up on Marketplace, and we're going to go through the whole entire process, all of the episodes combined into one from start to finish. You ready? Let's do this. Check out this wonky contraption that I just picked up. This is what we're going to need to modify. This is some sort of a homemade belt sander, really. The story goes that the guy who built it, I don't know, somebody's grandpa, I'm guessing, looks like something my grandpa would have made, was an engineer of some sort, and put this together for use in his workshop. Pillow block bearings, regular, I don't know, cast iron pipe, something like that. Spins really nice, actually. I'm pretty impressed. I think it's just pretty cool. Because like I said, it looks like something my grandpa put together. Right now it's coupled to an old 3/4 horse Craftsman motor. Who knows what that came off of? Maybe a washing machine, maybe some other piece of equipment. I don't really know. I think it's pretty cool. In order to modify this thing, first we kind of need to take it all apart and get it off of this giant table. There is 0 chance that I can use it with this table. We need to make this thing into some sort of a benchtop type of deal, or at least something with a much smaller base. So first order of business, we got to do some disassembly. This table's got this vise mounted on here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I'm going to set that aside and use it for something later. This little shelf on the bottom, I can tell that there used to be a motor mounted down there. It's set up as some sort of a tensioner. Who knows what other piece of equipment was mounted on the side of this table, but this was definitely a belt tensioner system of some sort. Now I'm just working on unbolting the motor as well as the sander from the table. I'm going to end up using this table for something else. I just know that for this particular project, it's just too big. And once I got it apart, I realized that somebody also spent a fair bit of time on just the table and the legs. Well, that pretty much wraps up the disassembly. Now we got a better idea of kind of what we're working with here, and we can start to figure out what we need to change, modify, redo as we move forward. I just took the top off of this thing, and I was looking at how they made this, and this is not separate pieces of angle iron. They've actually V-notched the angle and bent that around. All 4 corners. And then right here, it's mitered, and this is the only weld. That's kind of cool. Somebody really took the time to really make this kind of nice. After disassembling everything, I've got the main body of the sander inside here where we can sort of work on it. This is the main section that we're going to be working on. I'm going to repurpose the table for other things. I'm not going to throw it out or anything. I got some other uses for it, but for this particular project, I'm not going to be using that table, mainly this part right here, as well as the motor. Let's take a little bit closer look at this thing. I think it's awesome. I can really tell just by looking at some of the parts on here that somebody really spent quite a bit of time trying to put this together. I can see layout fluid on these aluminum U-bolt brackets here. One cool thing is these rollers are hardwood. So somebody glued up some hardwood, turned it down. These look like they're all possibly custom made brackets and arbors that bolt on there. It just looks like somebody really spent some time on this. Super cool. One of my goals for this project is to maintain as much of this original portion as I can. I kind of want to pay homage to the person that spent their time and energy to create this thing. I just think it's so cool. I don't really want to change this, but I don't think we really need to, which is kind of cool. If we flip this up, and it's sort of laying on this edge right here, it stands on its own. So that's a good thing, and that's kind of what helped spark the idea of how we could modify this. What I think I want to start out with is I want to make some little L brackets that bolt on to these original aluminum clamps here. We'll just take these nuts off, bolt on some brackets that come down, and then we have a little L here that we can secure to another table, which I already have in mind for this project. Hopefully it'll work. And then really, that'll mount the sander on end. And from there, it's just figuring out how to mount the motor and some sort of a table, maybe some dust collection. I don't really know how far we're going to get. It's a pretty good chance that this is going to be multiple videos, kind of a series of converting this to an edge sander. But I think it's going to be super cool, and I can't wait to get it done. I can already visualize the project. We just got to bring that visualization to life. So we're going to start off, I think, by making some L brackets. I went to my local steel yard and I picked up some of this bar channel. I always called it C channel, but there at the shop they called it bar channel, so I guess bar channel it is. This I want to use to mount with those aluminum U brackets on the bottom of the sander. We'll drill some holes so that this bolts right to it. And then on this other side, I've got these shorter pieces. We'll 45 degree these angles here. Then we can weld that up, giving us some pretty sturdy L brackets. If we have to add some extra supports in here, we can do that. But first, I think I want to get the holes laid out to where these pieces will bolt on to these little brackets here. Then we'll weld these up and go from there. That should give us at least a pretty solid starting point for mounting this sander on the side. I'm going to pull one of these aluminum brackets off first. That way I can take some measurements and get the hole locations. Those holes aren't even drilled oversized. It's the perfect size. I want the bottom of the leg to be flush with the bottom of the sander, so I'm just using a block of wood. I can pull the steel up to, and now we can just take some measurements, transfer this hole location over to the steel. I loosened up the other bolts so that I can slide my ruler under it to take the measurements. We'll just do a test fit here. Holes line up. I'll need to get some longer bolts. I also discovered that if I mount this with the channel down, I can weld these legs on the back and I won't even have to worry about putting a 45-degree angle on these. Well, I've got all the holes drilled. Actually, that turned out to be a little bit trickier than I thought. The holes are very close to the same spot on all of them, but they're not exact. So I ended up having to take a file and just file a little bit of an oval shape in a few of these. That way they dropped in place. Plus that gives us a little bit of adjustment. That way, once we weld these up, we can make sure they're all sitting flush with the table when we bolt them down. So it worked out in the end. While I was drilling all these holes, I also drilled a couple holes in these shorter pieces that'll be used for mounting this whole contraption to the table later on. I believe now we're ready to dig out the welder, fire that thing up, and glue these together. Before I can weld these together, I need to clean up the metal. There's a little bit of surface rust and some crud on there. A flap disc cleans it up real quick. And now we can set these up to weld them. I'm going to use some of these magnetic welding clamps to hold everything in place while I get it tacked. Just double checking to make sure that it stays as square as I can keep it. There's one. There's two. There's three and four. Now I'm going to go ahead and bolt these brackets in place over top of these existing aluminum brackets here. And after looking at it, I don't even think I need to get longer bolts. I think this is going to work fine. I'll just use some flat washers on there, get them all bolted in place. Before we try to stand this up, I think now would be a good time to remove these original feet. They're just pipe fittings. We'll just unscrew those because we're not going to be using them like that anymore. What are they, glued in place? There we go. They're really on there. I'll probably get some pipe plugs just to plug these holes, just to keep dirt and stuff out of there. I don't know if it'll build up in there or not, but if we plug it off, then at least we don't have to worry about it. We'll just snug these down a little bit. I'll probably have to take this apart probably 25 times before we're done. Definitely going to have to put a coat of paint on them. They're not fully tight, but they're definitely tight enough to where nothing's going to move around. Let's see if this stands up on its end. So I've got it clamped to the back of the table. I know you can't really see that very well, but just to kind of hold it. Let's see how square it is. I'm just using a combination square. I know right now it's not super precision, but from what I can tell, it's pretty square. We can fine tune once we get a little farther if we need to add some shims or something to make sure it's nice and square. For now, I'm happy with that. I think what I'd like to do now is to get this situated roughly on the table that it's going to sit on. The original base was way too big, and I've got a smaller, sort of a narrow table that I think is going to work good for this project. I want to drag this outside because that way I've got a little bit more room to work around, kind of get this maybe even just clamped in place on the table, and then start working out where the motor needs to go. The motor's going to mount to the side of this table, but I need to figure out exactly the height that I need to mount it. So that way, while I've got the welder out, I can weld in some supports, which will eventually mount the motor. We've got a cold front and possibly some snow coming in today. So while I've got the welder out and the weather's nice, I want to try to get some of this welding done. That way I can bring everything back inside and continue working on it while the weather's nasty for a couple of days. Let's drag this outside. This ought to be fun. This is definitely not liked. Did I bring any clamps with me? Of course not. Oh, look. Is it going to stay? Will I leave this and go grab clamps? I think it is. We'll just use a couple of C-clamps for now. There's barely any movement in that. Wow, I'm impressed. I thought for sure I would need to use some little triangles or some other supports, but I think that's going to be plenty solid, just like that. The motor's going to need to go here, right there, basically. When I picked up all the metal at the steel shop, I had them cut me a couple of tubes here that I can add into this existing table, some 1x1 square tube. The way I plan on attaching this is I want to leave these a little bit wider than the spacing on the motor, and then I've got some 1/4-inch flat bar that I'll probably bolt, maybe weld in place. I'm trying to build in a little bit of adjustability somehow, so later down the road, if we need to make any sort of changes or maybe adjust something. So I'm trying to determine the best place to weld in these tubes. I think it's definitely safe to say that once this is done, this is going to be pretty heavy. Well, after a whole lot of back and forth, lifting that motor up, I think I've got this down to where it'll work. Got my measurements, I believe, where they need to be to give me a little bit of room in case I need to adjust. So I think that's where I need to weld these in. Now I just need to spend a few minutes cleaning off this paint, and then we'll fire up the welder and burn these guys on. I think it's going to be just in time too. The sun's shining, it's nice out, but I can see some clouds over on the horizon and the wind's picking up. So let's get this welded. There we go. That's not going anywhere. And it's really cooling off. I think we're gonna get this part done anyway, just in time. Well, what a difference a day makes. Yesterday we were outside welding on this sander project. Today, wind, snow, I don't know how much snow, several inches so far. Good thing we got that done when we did. Let's get out of this snow, head back into the shop and see if we can keep working on this sander project. We got lots of stuff we can still do. I think maybe it's a good time to focus on figuring out how we're gonna mount this motor. To mount this motor, I've got an idea of how I wanna pull this off. I gotta get the camera in a position to where I can kind of show you this. Might be a little bit tricky because with the sander sitting right here, we're a little tight on space. So I think this will work. It's not a horrible angle and you can see what we're looking at here. So these two bars are specifically for mounting the motor. One thing that I need to keep in mind is that I've got about a 2-inch difference between where the center line of this shaft is and the center line of the motor is. If I bolt the motor right to these bars, I'm about 2 inches back. So I need to build this out 2 inches. Another thing that I want to keep in mind is adjustability. I don't want to chance just drilling a hole and mounting something rigid. If I'm off a little bit, these motor shafts aren't going to line up. So I need to be able to adjust things to make sure they line up perfectly. I've got some 1-inch tubing and some 1/4-inch flat bar. I want to combine those to make basically a bracket that will sit here. We'll have a bolt that goes through here, and as well as one on the bottom. We'll cut some small pieces of the plate, and it'll basically clamp onto this bar. That'll let me slide things back and forth. One other thing that I have going for us right now is that this is not bolted to the table. I've got it centered up on the table, but once I get this framework put together, if it still doesn't line up, I can shift this entire sander one way or another a little bit and get it to line up perfectly. I think that plan is going to work out well. I just need to get to cutting these pieces of tubing down, as well as this flat bar, and building this bracket. Really not a whole lot that I need to build, just cutting it to size, drilling some holes. I guess that's going to be one advantage to it being a snowstorm outside. I don't have to worry about sparks causing a fire. Now I just need to drill a few mounting holes in those pieces, which will allow us to clamp it to the table. And now we can see if all of our bolt holes line up. Well, I think that'll work. I need to get some one size longer bolts and washers and things. I don't have room for all that right now, but for test fit, that's going to work. Now I just need a couple pieces that can mount this way, which will actually be bolted to the motor. I changed my mind about how I wanted to orient the pieces that'll bolt to the motor. Instead of going horizontally, I decided to cut some pieces that'll bolt on vertically. I drilled a couple mounting holes and tapped them for the bolts. This way I can just bolt the pieces to the motor, and then I'll be able to set it in place, line everything up with the brackets that are already there, and weld everything down. When it's all assembled, I'll have two pieces of 1-inch tubing stacked on top of each other, which will space this motor out the 2 inches that I need, and hopefully everything will line up exactly. So now I'm facing a bit of a challenge because I need to hold the motor in place, get everything aligned, get everything clamped in place and secured, and the motor's not super light, so trying to hold that up here while aligning everything with the rollers and all that, it's really kind of a challenge. While this would be probably easier if I could bring this outside where I had a little more space to work on it, it's still snowing here. And it's supposed to keep snowing for a couple days. So I got to come up with a different method. I think what I need to do is stand this on end. That way I can just set the motor in place. I'll have to put some blocks underneath part of the sander because, well, with the roller here, it can't quite sit flat on the floor. So I got to get a little bit creative, and I'm going to be using the GoPro here a little bit more because I'm quickly running out of space for a tripod. This thing takes up quite a bit of floor space, so we'll get a little bit creative and see if we can't get this thing stood up. That way I can set the motor on here and it won't slide around. I'll be able to get everything aligned. Hopefully it works out all right. That looks about right.
Now
Now we just need to get some C-clamps in there to hold that motor in place. I'm looking at the coupler here. It looks like I need to scoot this up just a little bit in order to get this aligned exactly. Remember, this piece is only clamped in place on the table. So I think if I mount the motor right here and then I can scoot this just a little bit, that'll align that pretty much perfect. That looks pretty good. Since this is what we're dealing with outside right now, there's zero chance I'm going to drag this thing outside to weld it up. So I'm going to have to do something that I don't like to do, and well, I think I've only done once or twice. We're going to have to weld these brackets in place inside the shop. Let's see how this goes. I'm going to use a couple of leather welding jackets to try to contain some of the sparks. I don't want them flying all over the place, so I want to do what I can to try to keep those contained. With everything now tacked into place, now I get to wrestle this thing back into an upright position. This is really kind of tricky. Piece of cake. What was I worried about? Oh, my back. I had to venture out into the snow so that I could hit my local hardware store to get the right size bolts I need to finish bolting everything in place. With the motor bolted into place, I don't see why we can't fire this up. Now, this is not wired or anything like that. That's going to come later on. For now, I'm just going to connect this end to this extension cord with some wire nuts, and we'll be able to plug this in and at least give it a test run. Now, I already have a majority of the pieces for the wiring. I've got the start-stop switch and that sort of thing, but there's a few components that I'm still waiting on. They were supposed to have been delivered about 4 days ago, but I'm about positive that they got delayed because of the snow. Otherwise, we might temporarily hook up a switch or something like that, but for now, this is going to work. Now, I'm going to be replacing all of this wiring because there's no ground. This is the ground coming from my extension cord. There's no ground connected in here. So I already know that that's not safe. We're just going to fire this up as a test, and we're going to fix all of that wiring stuff later on. So if you're going to do something like this, make sure you know what you're doing, be confident in your abilities, and be safe. Don't electrocute yourself. This is not going to stay like this. Don't worry. All right, here we go. Let's see what happens. Let's try it out. It's alive! That's awesome. It works. Everything seems to be okay. Nothing really seems to be binding, or no issues here with our motor alignment or anything like that, at least for now. I'm going to call that a win for phase 1 of the giant edge sander build. We're going to start in today on phase 2, which is going to be to create some sort of a work platform here to support your workpiece. Otherwise, you're going to have to hold on to it. It's going to be really awkward. We need some sort of a work table. So that's what we're going to work on. I want to have the ability to adjust the height of this work table so that we can use the entire belt. If we're sanding something thin, we don't always have to sand in the same spot. We can change the height. I think that's going to help us get better use of these giant belts. I don't want to have to buy a new one just because I wore out one little strip. It could get expensive pretty quick. So the one thing that I decided on was that I want this platform to be adjustable, and I think I got it figured out. I want to mount the table on some linear rail. By having these bearings on here, it'll slide up and down really nice. We'll have some sort of a hand crank in the center to actually adjust the height. And since everything's running on the rails will help keep everything from racking back and forth, keep it nice and even, and allow it to smoothly raise and lower. To mount the bearings, I want to use some 1/4-inch flat bar. This will eventually get bolted solid to the table of the machine. And basically, I want to mount the bearings right around this area. By having it mounted to this plate, it's going to keep everything nice and flat. Then when the plate gets bolted to the side of the machine, the bearings will be fixed in this shaft. We'll be able to slide up and down. We'll have the tabletop connected up here, which is a little bit unconventional. It's not typically how you use these. Usually you'll mount something here so that I can slide back and forth. But in this application, I'm going to have the bearing blocks fixed and the shaft will be able to move. One thing that'll make this kind of nice is these bearing blocks already have screw holes. So all I really need to do is lay everything out on this flat bar. We can clamp them in place and I can mark all those holes. I'm going to try to leave them on this shaft while I'm doing all of that alignment. That way, there's no chance that they can get skewed. The shaft will keep everything in alignment while we mark and get the holes drilled. The center punch I'm using is a Starrett 48-B. This thing is a beast for making marks in metal. A lot of times I'll use this little automatic center punch for marking wood and that sort of thing. This Starrett has a way stronger punch and it's a hardened steel tip. I don't think this little guy here is a hardened steel tip. This one does work great for wood, but for making marks in metal, this Starrett is awesome. To the drill press we go. That's the last mounting hole drilled. Now we can line up the bearing blocks on these and get those holes marked. I'm going to clamp these blocks in place so that they can't move around while I mark the hole locations. Now I'll just measure, make sure the blocks are centered up on this piece of flat bar, trying to keep everything as square as possible. I don't have any sort of fixture table or anything like that, so I'm just relying off measurements as best I can. I'm going to transfer these hole locations in the bearing blocks to the flat bar using a transfer punch that's the exact size that needs to be for this hole. That way the hole location will be perfect because I plan on tapping this flat bar so that I can screw the bolts right into this piece. Now we have perfectly marked holes that exactly match these bearing blocks. And now it's back to the drill press to drill out these mounting holes. Once they're all drilled, I'm going to tap these for a 12/24 screw. As I was tapping these, I realized I really like the sound that a tap makes when you're tapping metal. So here's a little bit of metal tapping ASMR. That's the last hole. All tapped. Now, in theory, we should be able to lay those bearing blocks back on here and screw everything down. Now, for some reason, it's at this step that I ran into a bit of a problem, and I don't know why. Maybe you guys can help me understand this. I tapped these holes for a 1224 screw because that's the closest size outside of a metric that fit the holes that are already in these bearing blocks. Once I got these tapped, I checked the screws that I have on hand because I have a collection of different sizes of screws, 832, 1032, 1224, and 32, but I didn't have anything long enough. So I thought, well, I'll just run to the hardware store and grab some. It turns out most hardware stores, for some reason, don't carry 1224 or even 1232. Why is this? The closest hardware store to me had nothing. Their collection went from 832, 1032, right to quarter 20. Totally skipped over every single 1224 or even 1232. So I had to drive into town and I went to another place, one of the big box stores, where they have basically a whole aisle full of drawers you can pull out and sort through different pieces of hardware. They too did not have any 12, 24, or 32. Finally, I found the screws that I need at my local Ace Hardware. They have a really nice selection of screws, and they actually had some 1224s. They had the length that I need there, except they were 4 screws short for the steel ones. So I picked up a few of the same size in brass. Now this is a lot softer material. It's going to work fine for now, and my intention is to get some more of the right size and swap these brass ones out later, although most likely these will probably work fine and I'll never swap them out. But it's my intention to swap them out later. Let's get these things bolted in place. And what I want to know is, why are 1224 screws so hard to find? I don't understand. Never in my life would I have thought that it was hard to find this size, but apparently it is. Just a little bit long, but that's going to be fine. We got a linear rail. Slides nice. And with this mounted to the side of the table, we can attach the tabletop to these brackets here, and that should let it move up and down. And to attach these to the table, my plan is to bolt them through these holes here, right about in this location. The biggest issue is now I don't have a bar at the bottom to bolt these to. I could drill holes through these mounts for the motor, but I kind of want to keep everything symmetrical from side to side. On the other side, I'm going to have to add one more piece of square tubing right here to bolt the bottom. So I think while I'm adding that, I'm going to add another one here. That'll give me a piece of square tubing at the bottom. I'll use the existing tube at the top. We'll drill some through holes in here, bolt them in on both ends. That means I need to dig out the welder and weld in some more tube. I'm a little hesitant to do that because last time I did some welding, the very next day, we got 3 days straight of heavy snow. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time, but I got to take this thing all back apart, remove the sander. I'm going to take the motor off. We'll take the table back outside, clean off the paint, set everything up for welding, and burn in some more square tubes. Fingers crossed for no snow. Now my weld beads are coming back. It's been a while since I've welded this much. And kind of like everything, if you don't do it very often, you kind of lose your practice. Don't touch it, it's hot. But it's laying down a lot nicer. I can see the heat soaking into the piece on either side. I'm happy with that one. And while I was at it, remember those motor mount pieces that I welded inside the shop during the snowstorm? I'm going to finish welding those now as well. I decided now would be the time to start adding paint to some of these parts. Look at that. I guess I didn't let it cool quite enough. Does that mean this paint is heat baked? Before I can start painting this base, I need to remove this plywood top and then spend a few minutes sanding just to make sure everything comes out nice and smooth. Now it probably would have been better to remove all of this existing red paint, but I figure if I just scuff it up, it's going to come out just fine. That's looking pretty good. I think we'll just let this dry for a little while out here in the wind and hope it doesn't start snowing. Then we can go about getting this thing reassembled. Well, good morning. It's a new day. I've let the paint dry overnight for the base. Should be plenty dry by now. So let's get back into the shop and get back to work. While everything's disassembled and I've got easy access all around this table, I want to get these plates that hold the bearings attached. And this one here, I've pulled the bearings back off. That way I'm not trying to handle a big heavy unit. I just have this plate. To locate these, I'm going to use some scraps of wood that I can clamp on to the edge of this table. And this will be a stop. So all I have to do is line the plate right up against those scraps of wood. I've got another piece of steel here, which I'll just lay on the top. Now, if I butt the piece up against the pieces of wood and just up against this piece of metal, we'll clamp that in place right there and we can drill the holes. I do still need to put some paint on these plates, but I ran out of paint when I was painting the table. That's all right. We'll be able to do that a little bit later on. And now with this plate clamped in place, I can use a transfer punch, mark the hole location on these rails, and then I'll drill and tap those so that I can bolt these on. I'm not going to drill through holes all the way through this piece because I want the inside to be free of any sort of obstruction. So I'm just going to drill a hole through the outer layer of this steel tube, and then we'll tap that for some bolts. Now I'll tap those holes with a 1/4-20 tap. I gotta put something under this leg. In the first video when I ran this and you saw it wobbling around, that was because the table was not sitting level, allowing it to rock. It wasn't the machine or the belt or anything flopping around. The movement that you saw was because the leg was not sitting level and it's kind of driving me crazy. Fixed. And now we should be able to just use some bolts, bolt these plates on. I'm using flat washers and lock washers because I don't want anything to vibrate if the machine's running and maybe come loose. I wouldn't want these to drop off. I doubt they would, but with a lock washer, then at least I don't even have to worry about it. Ah, that's not going anywhere. I think that's going to work good. Now I've got to repeat that process for 2 more corners of this table base. My little workshop here is really starting to smell more like a metal shop than more of a wood shop, but you guys know I do all kinds of different projects, and these are the types that I don't really do all that often, but man, when I get the chance to do them, I really enjoy this type of work, figuring out mechanisms and how things need to fit together, and just something I really enjoy doing, and I'm having a good time working on this project. There we go. I've got the third rail mounted. They're all in place. They all move up and down smoothly. Now I'm going to reinstall the original top that was on this table. It's possible that maybe later on down the road, I might swap this out, but for now, I'm going to roll with this, see how it works. The way this whole thing is going to work is the table is going to be mounted to these rails, and the rails will just allow it to smoothly slide up and down, and it'll provide it some support. The bearings will keep everything in alignment so that it can't rack back and forth or tip and somehow be unstable. What's going to do most of the work is a hand crank that I have that's going to get mounted right in the center. I'm going to be able to crank it up, which will raise the table, crank it back down. So most of the weight is going to be supported by this hand crank. I need to make sure that this tabletop is sturdy enough to support all of the weight. I'm going to make the table out of wood, so it's not going to be overly heavy, but by the time you get some of the weight of these rails in there, there is going to be a little bit of weight. So I want to make sure this is nice and solid. I've cut a piece of plywood, which is actually a scrap from the table that this sander originally was mounted on. So I'm trying to reuse as many of the pieces that went with this as possible. All this piece is going to do is going to get mounted up underneath here, underneath this piece of plywood. I'll glue that in place, and then we'll hold it in place with some screws because it's going to be hard to clamp. The reason I did not put this on ahead of time is because I want to make sure the tabletop is right where it goes, and then this fits just inside the rails. So by gluing it on now, it's going to be positioned exactly where it needs to be. I'm not super concerned with having 100% glue coverage. There's going to be enough surface area to this panel that it's going to be plenty strong. Whoa. That should provide plenty of reinforcement to make sure there's no movement in this top. So I got the sander back onto the tabletop. Right now it's still clamped in place, but I think we're at a spot now where I can start taking some measurements as to where these brackets are, and we can start actually working on the work table that's going to support our workpiece. This was quite a bit of work trying to get everything lined up, keeping everything straight and square. Took a little bit longer than I thought. I was hoping to have the table completed, but we're going to get to that in the next one. There's one thing that I want to work on before I actually start cutting any material for this tabletop. Right now, these linear rails are all independent. They can all move at different heights. And my thought is, if I don't build the table rigid enough, maybe we could get some racking in there, which may cause our table to not sit level. I want to use some angle iron to kind of tie these brackets together. That way they'll move a little bit more in sync with each other. Since these brackets that clamp onto the shaft have bolt holes already on here, I think this is going to be really quite easy to do. We'll just mark the hole locations in our angle iron, drill those holes, and then we can bolt this together. I think this is going to be super easy for these brackets in the front because they'll be able to move up and down together. We'll have to do something a little bit different on these two linear rails to lock them together because we have the sander in the way. So maybe we'll just tie it together with the brackets on the bottom with another piece of angle iron. I'll line up the angle iron where I want it to go and temporarily clamp it in place using some small C-clamps. Then I just need to trace the hole locations with a pencil through the holes in the bracket and onto the angle iron. Then we can just drill those out over at the drill press. With the holes drilled, I'll reattach it to the brackets using some bolts. And that ties the first pair of linear rails together. To connect the other two linear rails together, I did the exact same thing with a short piece of angle iron, but I connected them underneath the machine instead of on top. With all three linear rails connected together, that means our table is going to stay nice and level as it moves up and down. And speaking of that table, I think we need to make that now. I chose to use some MDF to build this work table mainly because it's super stable and it's nice and flat. It's going to work really good. I don't want to have to worry about temperature or humidity affecting the flatness of the table. There is one challenge though. I'm going to have to do a few of these next steps outside because the size of the material just won't fit in here. I don't have room. I picked up a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch MDF. I did have the big box store rip it into half, so I have two 8-foot long, 2-foot wide strips, and there's just not enough space in here. I want to have a 10-inch wide work surface on the front of the machine. So I'm going to lay out a couple of lines here to tell me about where that 10-inch width is going to be. That'll give me a reference line to line up the sander on. Ugh. This is heavy. That's all I can say. Get off my glove. I'm just using a scrap of metal here, kind of as a straight edge, because I want the edge of my belt to be just about on my pencil line. Now I'll just use my straight edge as sort of a compass. At least I'm going to try to run this around, basically tracing out the edge of the belt. That looks really close. Now if I take the sander back off, you can see we're left with sort of a candy cane looking shape. All we need to do is cut this out, and this will be our work table, at least the rough outline of it. decided that it would probably be a good idea to round off the corners at the end that wraps around the belt, because if I leave a square corner, I know I'm going to be the one to smash into it. All right, let's test fit our giant MDF candy cane. Wow. Hey, that fits pretty good. We'll just temporarily clamp it in place so we can clean up a little bit of this curve here before we make the second layer. Rubs in a little spot right here. Probably just use the belt to clean that up. Now I'll just spend a few minutes with a sanding block with some sandpaper attached just to smooth out these curves and make sure there's no irregularities. Now we'll take our giant candy cane, line that back up on this offcut here. I'll trace out one side. I'm holding my pencil at an angle so that it traces outside of the cut line. This will just give me a rough outline that I can cut away quickly with the jigsaw. Now I'll take my slightly oversized piece and I'm going to glue that to the first piece that I already cut. This will give me a double layer work table that's 1.5 inches thick. That should be plenty enough material to keep this table nice and flat for a long time. While I waited for that glue to dry for a few minutes, I drilled some holes in the angle irons that I would use later on to attach this top. And now it's time for what I would call the messiest part of this entire project. I'm using a flush trim bit in my router to trim the second piece of MDF to exactly the same size as the first. That's the worst. And to think, I thought for a minute that I would do this inside. Ugh, it's horrible. And I think it was right here when I actually broke my microphone. I didn't realize it had damaged anything, but I guess it did. Apparently, microphones don't like to hang by their cord. Who knew? Test fitting the top, everything fits really good. I'm super happy with this. I'm impressed with how well it fits around this roller. I'm gonna pull this thing off for now and set it aside. And a side note, somehow when I was cutting this tabletop out, I managed to break my lapel mic. So now I'm gonna have to use this little thing here. Usually my lapel mic clips into that. That way I don't have this block sitting here, but somehow I broke it. I guess it's not as durable as I thought. So I'm now in the market for a new lapel mic. If any of you have any good suggestions for a good, durable, heavy duty type of lapel mic that sounds good, let me know. Leave it down in the comments because I'm gonna need a new one now. For now, we're just gonna use this and keep on rolling. The next thing I need to work on is getting this hand crank mounted. In playing around with this, right now I've got a block of wood in here, I've kind of figured out that I need to mount this a little bit to the left side of the table, mainly because of the weight distribution. If I mount it right in the center, there's a little bit more weight on this left-hand side, so I need to scoot this somewhere to this, a few inches off of center. That way, the weight is more evenly distributed. When this is in operation and I crank this up, I don't want this pushing directly on the bottom of the table. It'll lift everything that way, but the weight of these rails is gonna be pulling down on the table. And while I think this tabletop is durable enough that it would not warp under the weight of these rails, I kind of want to have this lifting on this piece of angle iron as well. I've made up this little steel plate that I want to weld to this angle iron. That way, this will also attach to the bottom of the MDF table, but this clamp will also push up on this plate. Since it's connected to the angle iron, it'll be supporting some of the weight of these rails as well. And I think overall, that's going to be a better way to go. I have a little 3D printed bracket that I'm going to use to hold the end of this hand crank to the bottom of the table. I'm going to line that up in place on that steel plate, and then I'll lower the entire thing down, letting the 3D printed bracket rest on the table. Then I'll just trace the hole location onto the tabletop, and this will mark where I need to drill. I just realized that in order to be able to drill this hole out, I probably need to pull this rail back off again. That's fine. It's not surprising that you have to take things apart 100 times with a project like this. Sometimes you just don't know your exact order of operations until you find out. Ow! Pinch my finger. And we'll take our clamp apart. This little block that I 3D printed is really just to kind of hold everything in place because there's no mounting holes in this plate. Now, when I built the acoustic guitar side bender, I drilled mounting holes in this and it worked out okay, but I thought it might be a little better if I could do this without modifying it. So I just made this little 3D printed bracket. And all it does is just surround this thing and kind of just capture it. This is what will attach to the tabletop. This will still sit flush against the tabletop, so this piece won't really be supporting much, if any, weight. It's just holding this bracket in place. And we can thread our press clamp back up through. This is something else that's probably going to have to come off a time or two, especially when it comes time to insert those screws. So there, now you can sort of see how this is going to raise and lower the entire table. So I've got the angle iron piece bolted back into place, and I also spent a few minutes off camera reinstalling the motor. I'm ready to bolt the table on, but before I do that, I wanted to make sure that the sander is exactly where it needs to go. I want to make sure it lines up with the motor. Everything is in place. It all lines up, spins nice, and I even added some bolts to those L brackets in the back of the sander. So this is now bolted in place to the table. We're ready to drop this work table in place and get it secured. Come here, giant candy cane. I'm going to raise this up, even though it's not really bolted to the machine yet. All right, now we'll get everything lined up. Clamp that in place, and that's where the table needs to go. For now, I'm going to secure the table with some construction-grade screws through those holes that I drilled in the angle iron. Eventually, I might swap these screws out for threaded inserts, and then I'll use some bolts to secure the tabletop to the machine by using the screws first I do have the ability to plug and re-drill the hole. If I went right for threaded inserts now, that's going to leave me a lot bigger hole that I have to deal with if I need to make any more adjustments. Take off our clamps. Hey, it's one of those standing desk things. I think I'm going to plug it in and kind of let this belt self-clearance where it needs to. It is rubbing in a couple spots. I think just a few seconds of this running will take care of that in no time. Done. I put a little bit of grease on the screw clamp here and a little oil back on the linear rails. They were oiled when I got them, but handling them kind of rubbed some of the oil off. Now it runs really smooth. It works really nice. Not only does the table move up and down nicely, it's pretty sturdy too. I think this is going to hold plenty of weight, probably way more than I'll ever put on this thing. So far, this is awesome. Now, it was my intention in this episode, once we got the table made, I was going to cover this with some laminate material like you'd find on a countertop. However, none of the stores locally had it in stock and I have to order some in. So I'm going to get some of that ordered, and at some point we will glue on some laminate on here so it does look more like a countertop. So that's going to wrap up phase 2. Coming up in phase 3, that's where we're going to tackle the wiring. We need to completely rewire this motor so that it has the proper 3 wires to keep everything safe. We need a real on and off switch of some sort. So that's going to be coming up next, getting everything tidied up, cleaned up, and hopefully wrapping up this project. I believe first I want to tackle the little housekeeping things, just kind of make this look a little bit neater. And really, a lot of that is just going to be painting a few of the parts that I haven't gotten to painting yet. None of the pieces that I have to paint are really all that big, but the biggest thing is I got to disassemble pretty much everything. I need to take these L brackets that are on the back, need to remove them so that we can paint those. And then the brackets that are down below that are holding the linear rails and a few other bits and pieces. Since you watched me put all this stuff together, you sort of have an idea of how everything goes on there. So I think we're just going to jump right into a time lapse of pulling all this stuff back off. But the only thing that I'm not going to remove is the motor. It's all got to come back apart. After I had all of the pieces removed that need painted, I spent several minutes using a flat disc on my angle grinder, just cleaning up the pieces and removing a little bit of surface rust. And now it's time to start painting parts. Here's a pro tip for you. Make sure you read the color on your can before you start painting. For some reason, I didn't think this color was looking quite right. I just realized what I thought was black paint is not black paint. Guess I gotta go to the store to get the right color. This is dark walnut. That looks better. It's not brown. Well, I have all the parts painted. Let them sit overnight so everything's dry. It's time to get this thing assembled. I'm using this square to make sure that the bottom of the sander is flush with this bracket. I don't want to have any gap there that could cause this thing to rock. Now we'll stand this back up, get it bolted back in place. Make sure everything's lined up before I tighten up these bolts. That looks good. I'll just reinstall the brackets for our linear rails. I think the hard part now, since I've got everything taken apart, is finding all the bolts. There's bolts everywhere. Now I can just reinstall my linear rails, get those all back in place. I've got a little spacer block underneath here just to give me the height that I need out of that adjustable press clamp. With all the parts painted and now reinstalled, it's time to put our candy cane work table back in place. These little right-angle drill attachments, man, they're so handy. You hardly ever use them, at least I do, but when you have an application where you can use it, they're a lifesaver. Table reinstalled. With the table on, let's see if we're roughly square. I've got it pressed right up against the belt. That looks perfect. We'll check it here on the end. And that is really good. I don't think I could get that a whole lot squarer than it actually is. Wow. While I was doing all of this disassembly, painting, reassembling everything, the 3D printer robot was hard at work in the background, printing the electrical box. I think now it's done printing, so let's go grab that electrical box so we can start installing components and getting this thing wired up. And there's our custom 3D printed electrical enclosure. When I modeled up this enclosure, I built in some provisions for some heat set inserts. This is going to allow me to use some 632 screws to attach some of the components as well as the lid. If you do any sort of 3D printing like this and you've never tried heat set inserts, I highly recommend you look into them and consider trying them out in some of your designs. They really make attaching parts super easy. I don't think I could say enough how satisfying it is to spend a little time designing a part on the computer and then 3D printing it and having everything fit. Of course, you have to have all your components so you can take measurements, but I now have a custom 3D printed enclosure. All my components fit in there. And one thing that I would have a very hard time doing, and that's creating a custom faceplate with a different color lettering on here. It looks so cool. I could just switch out to a different filament, prints the letters. It looks awesome. I can't wait to get this thing put together. We'll just install a few of these components here, and then I'll show you basically how this thing's gonna work. Well, that looks super awesome and actually semi-professional, if I do say so myself. This is going to be awesome. Now, I'm not going to do an in-depth kind of tutorial or anything of how I'm wiring this up because, well, there's a ton of different ways you could do that, and everybody has different skill levels and things that they're comfortable with and not comfortable with. So you need to make that decision. Make sure you're doing things safe. Don't electrocute yourself. But here's a general overview of how this is going to be set up. I'm going to have power coming in. It's going to be running through this fuse, then going to this master power switch. Nothing else is going to have power until we hit the master switch. That's going to energize both of these auxiliary switches, which will be connected to some outlets that are going to go in the back here. That way I can run things like lights or whatever else I want to plug into it. From there, I'll have the power right here going from this start-stop switch. That'll turn on the main motor. Really easy paddle. You can quickly turn off if you ever need to. And really, that's about it. The other thing that I'm doing a little bit different is I'm using these contact blocks. That way I can connect everything together, and it'll be a little bit neater, I think, than having like wire nuts and stuff, a big glob of wires. Probably a little bit safer as well. I have one for each, the ground, the line, and the neutral, so that way I can keep things separated. Got some inputs coming in here where I'll have some cable clamps to connect the wires going in from the plug and out to the motor. So trying to keep everything nice and neat, and I think it's going to work great. Of course, we've got the threaded inserts in here, so everything attaches nice and clean. This will fit right on here when we're done. All we're missing now really is making up a bunch of connections, a bunch of wires, and getting everything wired up. One of my goals while wiring this entire control panel is to keep everything neat and tidy, and also ultimately nice and safe as well. That's one of the reasons I decided to use these terminal blocks instead of wire nuts or some other way to connect the wires. The terminal blocks keep everything neat and organized and really make it quite easy to connect your wires. To add a terminal to the end of each wire, I'm using some heat shrink crimp style connectors. So they just get crimped in place, and then I use my heat gun to melt the heat shrink, which keeps it really nice, and it looks pretty good too. While this is not an overly complicated wiring job, I did take quite a bit of time trying to do everything nice and neat, and eventually we got it done. Well, I think I've got everything wired as much as I can with this box on the bench. We've got the cord coming in, everything's wired. The only thing missing is running the cable in there, connecting the motor. All the functions are verified with a meter. Everything seems to be working the way I expect it to. So let's get this thing installed on the machine, and then we can wire in the motor. One cool thing that I found with the wiring that was already on the motor is that there really is a ground in there. They had just cut it off flush with the end. I don't know why they didn't wire it up with a ground, but all I had to do was strip some wire back. There's the ground wire. I verified in the box for the electric motor that it is connected. I don't know why they didn't use it, but it's there. I didn't have to replace this wire. So now we'll just run this through the strain relief, get it all connected, wired to the switch, ground attached, and we'll be ready to test this out. No sparks. Before I button this up, I'm going around now and just giving everything a final snug. I want to make sure all these connections are tight. I didn't somehow miss something. Loose connection can cause sparks or arcing, cause a fire, or just cause something to not work. So I'm going to take the time to make sure every single thing is tight. I used to work in equipment repair and maintenance for a lot of years, and a lot of times I've seen issues with equipment that really can be traced back to just wires being loose. I even had a piece of machinery catch on fire once because something in there was loose and it was arcing. It wasn't real bad, but the electrical box definitely had flames coming out of it. One of the few times I've ever actually had to use a fire extinguisher. Now I really just need to do a little bit of tidying up, get some of these wires secured. I 3D printed some little cable clamps here I'll use to just tie things up, make sure there's no extra strain on any of the wires. And then we're gonna be ready to power this up. I know we're not at a good angle here where you can really see what I'm doing, but just trying to tie these up as best I can. Now, before we put a fuse in this electrical box and power this thing up, there's one other issue that I want to address. It's completely unrelated to the electrical stuff, but something I want to take care of now. And that issue has to do with this hand crank here. I've found out through trial and error that when you go to adjust this, like if you were operating the machine, this other little nub here tends to hit your wrist, so you kind of got to bend at an awkward angle. It's not a huge deal, but it is kind of strange, and I've noticed already that it's kind of annoying. So I want to do something about that. Looking at this hand crank, I can see that the handle is just held in place with a roll pin. So that gives me an idea. I went into Fusion and designed my own hand wheel with only one little nub and 3D printed it. I think it's going to work awesome. Should just fit right into place. I'm using the original roll pin to secure my new handle. It fits great. Now I should be able to put this right back into place. And now there's nothing to smack your wrist when you're making adjustments. Super cool. I've designed quite a lot of parts for 3D printing, but for some reason I think this is one of the ones that I'm most happy with. The time has come. We got to test out this control box. We'll stick a fuse in the fuse holder. And now, the moment of truth. As long as we don't get any sparks, when we hit this master power, this should light up. We have a red light. I've taken the probes for my meter and put them in the outlet in the back. We should switch this on and see 120 volts, actually 119.8. That's interesting. So our outlets work, and the moment of truth, we hit the start button. What's going to happen? Will it turn on? Will it blow the fuse? I don't know. Let's find out. How cool is that? It works. No sparks. No fires. Not yet, anyway. We can use the new handle to adjust the tabletop. We're one step closer to wrapping up this edge sander. There's still a few things to do. I need to get the laminate for this tabletop, which is on order. I don't know when it's going to arrive, but it's not here yet. And also I'm working on some sort of a contraption down here at the end that I can use for dust collection. Hopefully in the next episode, I'll have all the materials. We can get that wrapped up. Almost, Mr. Sander. You're getting close to being put to work. Well, I believe we're coming into the home stretch on this homemade giant edge sander build. We've got it functional now. It's all wired up. Everything operates properly. And really, we could use this thing just the way it is. But I think there are a couple things that we need to take care of to make this even a little bit more functional and to look a little bit better. One thing that I need to tackle is some sort of dust collection. This is going to make a ton of dust, and we need some sort of a shroud to cover this end that we can connect the dust hose to be able to capture some of that dust. We definitely don't want to run this, at least not for very long, with no dust collection, because there's going to be piles of dust everywhere. So that's the first thing that we need to tackle. And then the second, like I mentioned in the last video, is to apply some laminate to this work table to not only make it look a little better, but I think it'll make it a little bit slicker as well if we need to slide some parts on there. But ultimately, I think it's just going to look a whole lot better. So first off, we're going to tackle this dust collection. To get a little bit more room to work, I want to once again remove this table. There goes that wobbly leg again. With the table out of the way, we now have a lot better access and can kind of work in here a little bit better. This is one step of the project that I probably struggled with the most, mainly because there's about 1,000 different ways you could accomplish this. Some of the ways that I thought about doing were welding up some sort of a framework that I could attach some sheet metal or some acrylic to, something like that. I thought about building something out of wood. Maybe it'd be easier to modify and change if I needed to. But overall, the method that I decided to at least try first is going to be kind of a combination of using some wooden parts in several pieces made on the 3D printer. I think by taking this approach, it's going to make this easier to modify in the future. I think this is possibly one of the areas that may see a revision or two as we put this to work, but I need something to start with, kind of a baseline, something to just get everything working, and then I can decide from there what I like, what I don't like, and make adjustments if necessary. I've modeled up a bunch of these parts in Fusion, and I've got some reference dimensions to go off of. So at first, I think we're just going to fire up the CNC machine and cut out what I'm going to call the base plate, which everything will end up attaching to. I'm using some 3/4 inch decent quality plywood to cut out this little bracket. I want to make sure it's nice and stable and doesn't move around. So here's our base plate right off the CNC machine. These ends here will attach to the tabletop, and then that will support all of the pieces for the dust shroud out around here. Should work really well. In order for this bracket to fit where I need it to, though, I need to glue on some spacers to the bottom. That'll lift it up off the tabletop, put it at the height that I need it to, so that I can attach the rest of the pieces. After the glue is dried, I'll drill a couple pilot holes for the screws at the drill press. Wooden base, complete. But what's going to wrap around it? Well, to figure this out, this took the longest time because I'm 3D printing all these parts, and really, I tried a bunch of different designs, different brackets, different ways that I was going to attach things. Probably used a roll of filament prototyping this. But these three parts here are the ones that I decided on that we're going to use for our dust collection. Now, they might look a little bit funny because I may or may not have miscalculated the amount of filament left on the roll, and the roll ran out. I didn't have enough to keep going with another roll without changing colors. So we're going to have to paint these. The challenge with designing these parts was coming up with a method that allowed them to fit together, because the finished piece is bigger than the print capacity of my 3D printer. But there's our finished dust shield. Well, I say finished. It's not really finished. We're going to paint these, then we got to glue these together. Then these get mounted to our plywood bracket, just like that. And then hopefully you can see how that's going to work. We got a provision on here for connecting a large dust hose. This is a 4-inch port. Should give us plenty of air movement. Shrouds the end, allows the dust to curl around and then go right out the port. I think it's going to work really well. I decided it's probably best to glue these together first. To hold them all in place, I'm using some CA glue. Then I'll add a couple of coats of black paint to make this dust shroud at least all one color. Once the paint's dry, now we can take our 3D printed cover and attach it to our plywood base. I've got holes right in the bottom for some screws. Just drive them in. Now we'll just take this contraption, slide it into place. I'm going to use a clamp on the back side to hold it down while I get everything aligned. After screwing that down, this is definitely not as solid as I was hoping. That's just not going to work. Oh, and it looks like I missed a spot with the paint too. So I guess it's back to the drawing board. I need to reinforce this connection to the table to make it more sturdy. Well, sometimes the idea that we have in our head doesn't always work out, especially with a project like this. You can't just go online and download the user manual and figure out what happened. There's no manual for this sort of thing, and we just have to figure it out kind of on the go. I've got the bracket pulled back off, and I think most of my problem came from the fact that these blocks are so narrow. I think what I need to do is extend those blocks. That way I can secure it farther back. That's going to give it a little more of a sturdy, solid connection and keep things from rocking around. Now I'm kind of wishing I hadn't glued these blocks on, but that's okay. We got a solution for that. To avoid having to cut out a new plywood base, I used a handsaw to cut off the blocks that I had just glued on. That left just a little bit of material on the pieces that I was able to quickly remove with a rasp. There we go. Almost like it never even happened. Just don't tell anyone. To fix this problem, hopefully, I'm going to basically do the same thing, but instead of those little skinny blocks, I've got some longer blocks that once we connect them to this piece and to the machine, we'll have more space in between there, hopefully a more stable footprint, and we won't have it wobbling around. For the block that goes on the back of the machine, I did have to cut a notch in here to fit over the L bracket that supports the sander. It's not going to affect it one bit. I'll still be able to put a screw in the back and a screw at the front. Should be nice and sturdy, hopefully this time around. Oh, that's already more solid. There's only one screw in there. I love it when Plan B comes together. See what I did there? Plan B, when a plan comes together. And now, for the moment we've all been waiting for. Well, at least I've been waiting for. My laminate finally arrived. It's time to see if we can apply some laminate to this giant candy cane table. This might be a little bit tricky for me to do because I don't have a ton of space, and the piece of laminate that I had to buy is 4x8. We'll figure it out. I figure this is going to probably be easier if we just do it outside. It's a nice day, so I don't see a problem with that. I'm going to use my compass to carefully scribe a line that's 2 inches wide down the side. I need a long piece to begin with so that we can put this on the end. We start with the end before laminating the whole tabletop. Now they make saw blades that you can use in your circular saw to cut this stuff. I don't have one. I don't really want to go buy one. So I don't know if this is going to work or not. I'm going to try a multi-tool with a nice fine blade in there. Some of you are probably cringing right now, but let's see what happens. Well, was that ideal? Probably not. But did it work? Absolutely. In order to trim this piece to length, I need to figure out where I need to cut it. To hold the piece in place, I'm just using a clamp on one end. Then I can wrap the piece around and just eyeball where I need to make a cut. Then using a sharp utility knife, I'll score the piece a couple of times, and then you can just snap it off. Hey, look at that. Score's nice. That'll be a piece for this end. We'll have to take a scrap from somewhere for this end. And now we can start applying some contact cement. This is where it's going to get stinky. And we're going to need to have some ventilation. I do like the smell of contact cement, but it's not good for you. So use proper ventilation. I'm using a foam brush to brush a heavy coat of glue on the outside edge of the table, as well as to the back of that strip of laminate. This stuff really brushes on quite nice. I've never really used a foam brush for contact cement, but wow, it works great. A lot of people did suggest using a roller, little paint roller, and I can imagine that would work really good too. But again, I didn't want to have to go buy one, so trying to use what I have. All right, I've got my contact cement on both the piece as well as the tabletop. We're just going to let that really dry for, I don't know how long it's going to take, maybe 10 minutes or so until it's tacky, but it doesn't look wet. And then we'll stick it in place. So I've let the glue sit about 10 minutes. It's tacky to the touch, but it does not look wet. It's time to stick this in place. I want to line this up roughly centered. Press it in place. I'm going to hold this side with a clamp. Just work my way around, making sure I have an overlap on both the top and the bottom. Now we'll grab our trusty J roller, just roll it on there. With that first strip glued in place, now I'll use a trim router with a flush cutting bit to trim that edge flush with the top of the table. I found this step to be just a little bit tricky, but overall not all that bad. Probably the hardest part was keeping the router flat against that narrow edge of the work table while working around this curved edge. I just took my time and it ended up working out just fine. I gotta say, that's probably the first time I've ever used a laminate trim router, to actually trim laminate. Who knew? With the first piece of laminate applied, now I'll apply some glue to the smaller strips that'll cover the ends. I cut these strips as well as the piece for the top while I was waiting for that first round of contact cement to tack up. Well, so far this is going pretty well. I've got both of the ends and the long strip all wrapped. Really, it's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. There's one little area on this corner here that got a little bit of a weird spot there. I don't know if I didn't hold the router bit quite right, but I'm not too worried about that. Everything else is looking good. Now, we got to do this top. I've got the piece cut here, but I think instead of trying to cut it to shape and get it close all the way around, because it is a little tricky to cut, at least with the equipment that I have, I think what I want to do is trace out the outline on this larger piece. That way I know where to apply the glue, and then I don't have to apply glue to a whole section where I'm not really going to be using it. We'll flip this over. Now, if we flip this 180 degrees, same with this, everything lines up. Now I know roughly where to apply the glue. When you're applying this amount of contact cement, I can't stress enough how important it is to have good ventilation. I had the doors open, there was a breeze blowing through, but yet the fumes got very strong, and while I was waiting for this to tack up, I had to step outside. Nobody light a match in here. I gotta get out of here while this is drying. Whew, the fumes are strong. So the fumes have somewhat subsided. The glue is just tacky. We're ready to stick this thing on here. Now it's gonna be really hard if I plop this thing down there all at once to get everything aligned, because as soon as that glue touches, it's gonna try to grab a hold. I found some threaded rods that I could place on here to use as spacers while I line everything up. Dowels would work equally as well, but I had these on hand already. Now I can set the piece of laminate in place, laying it on the threaded rods. This will allow me to get everything aligned before pulling out the threaded rods and sticking the laminate in place. Once I had the piece all rolled on there, now the trim router will cut everything flush and remove the waste. This actually worked really good. Boy, sure makes a mess. Ooh, that's cool. With the laminate trimmed flush, now we'll just reattach the table to the machine. Hopefully, this is the last time I need to do this. I need to do a little bit of cleanup along this front edge. Apparently, I got a little messy with the contact cement and there's some on the front. I'm going to use just a little bit of lacquer thinner on a rag to clean that off. I want just a little bit of thinner on this rag because I don't want it to soak into the glue line and maybe separate the laminate from the MDF. That table looks so cool. That's the first time I've ever installed any sort of laminate like this. And I would say for the first time, it turned out great. Super happy with that. We are so close to being done with this machine. But there's something I discovered that I don't quite like and I want to change really quick. When I painted this 3D printed Dust Collection Shield black, it's really just kind of the color that made sense. But now that I have the table on there, table's black, this is black, I really think that this shield would have looked better red, which is originally what I was going for until I ran out of 3D printer filament. So I want to paint this red, get rid of the black. There we go. Through the magic of television, it's red now. And I think it looks so much better. I'm glad I took the time to pull it back off, give it a coat of paint. Eventually, maybe I'll reprint this so that it doesn't have to be painted. I can just use red filament, but for now, it's perfect. Well, at this stage of the project, I think there's really only one, but extremely important detail that we need to attend to. Well, let's make it official and say that this edge sander build is done. Now, will there be some changes over time? I really can't say yet. I've tried to account for everything I can think of at the moment, but it's not until we put this thing to use it for a bit of time, see what I like, what I don't like, and if we need to make any modifications later on, we totally will. But for now, we're ready to crank this thing up and sand something. Now, before we start sanding on this piece of elm, we're going to get some dust this time around because I don't have the 4-inch dust port connected. This machine is not close enough to where my dust hose will reach. Once I get it moved into place, then I'll be able to connect it and everything will be working fine. But for now, we're just going to give it a test run. Just keep in mind that we're going to get a little bit of dust. That doesn't necessarily mean that my dust shield doesn't work. It's just not connected to vacuum. The dust is coming out the hole. So that was kind of neat. As I was sanding, the dust was going around the roller and coming out the dust port. That makes me feel pretty good that once there's vacuum attached to that, it's going to do a good job of collecting the dust. And with that, the giant edge sander's done. What a fun project. It's fun to try to figure out how to make certain things work, especially when they're not designed to work together. Makes you use a different part of your brain, and definitely something I enjoy. And I hope you all enjoyed following along. I'm going to go wrestle with this thing now, try to get it into place. Welcome, edge sander. You're dusty already. I'll just have to wipe this off with a cloth and so I can eat my lunch on here. It's like a dinner table, countertop, literally. So cool. So a show of hands of who made it to the end. If you did, thank you. That was a cool video. It's kind of fun putting everything together so I could watch the entire process basically uninterrupted from start to finish. It was an awesome project. I had such a fun time putting that machine together. And I know now that I'm going to have a pretty awesome thing that's going to be around the shop for many years to come. Thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you all next time.